All right, I got a confession to make, guys. I don't like poetry. I don't know what it is. There's just something about it that like I don't get, or I don't know. It's just not for me. Especially when you get these like live spoken word poetry performances. Something about it just feels weird to me. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like in the last few years I've seen a spike in these spoken word performances, like poetry slams and beat poetry, whatever you want to call it. And I feel like they've been showing up out of nowhere. But here's the thing. It's a big world. Not everybody has to like the same thing. If you like poetry, then great. I hope it brings you the feelings or whatever it's supposed to do. And I really mean it. I hope you enjoy it. But beyond my own personal bias about poetry and spoken word, there's something that makes me really nervous about this whole performance poetry craze. The only problem is that it's kind of complicated to explain. And by that, I mean it's really complicated to try and explain why I have this hesitation with performance poetry beyond my own personal issues with it. And there's no great way to go about it, so let's just dive in. Here's a question I want you to keep in mind. What's the difference between spoken word and rap? Spoken word is like a live performance of a poem. I'd consider it music, but that's a debate for another time. Now, rap, well, I honestly can't define rap, like what it is, what it isn't, how it sounds. I can't because I'm not a part of the culture. I'm not a part of the community. But what I can say is that rap is a vocal technique that is frequently performed in hip-hop, which means that rap music would be music that predominantly features rapping, the same way a song predominantly features someone singing. And trying to work out the origins of these types of performances can get kind of weird. Like, yeah, you have these big competitive poetry slams now, but then you had rap and hip-hop in the 80s. But back in the 50s and 60s, you had beat poetry. But in the 20s, you had Langston Hughes and jazz poetry. But then you can find evidence of Vikings and Anglo-Saxons flitting in the 16th century, which was basically a Thor-themed rap battle. And then you can also look at the griots of West Africa and their poetry-based system of cultural documentation. So trying to figure out which one came first is kind of difficult to do. But if rap is a vocal technique that is analogous to singing, then that means that you could technically perform rap in an acapella setting, like with no accompaniment, right? Like this?
I got a small circle. I'm not with different crews. We walk the same path, but got on different shoes.
So let me specify my question. Are spoken word and acapella rap the same thing?
Do you see rap music and spoken word poetry as interchangeable? I mean,
poetry in and of itself is such a big umbrella term. You know what I mean? So yeah, I would consider hip hop to be poetry, and I would consider spoken word to be poetry, but I would not consider hip hop to be spoken word.
No, poetry, but it really is. If poetry is the tree, then the different genres are the branches. On one branch, you have spoken word. On another branch, you have rap.
Okay, so it does look like they're different. Rudy Rudacious here actually has a really great way of explaining how these two genres are different.
Set up, punchline. Set up, line. You feel me? Even if it's not a punchline, but just set up, rhyme, set up, rhyme. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
That's a basic format of rapping.
So, at least from what I'm hearing, it looks like the difference between these two genres is that rap tends to have these specific rhyming and rhythmic patterns, whereas spoken word might not. Which, okay, but what happens when spoken word does have those similar rhyming and rhythmic patterns?
Perfectly trimmed cuticles, dressing something suitable and never rude or crude at all. Unimprovable, right on time as usual, more on cue than a snooker ball, but like to play it super cool.
I feel like you could easily put a beat to that, and the rhyming pattern sounds an awful lot like what I've heard in rap. So here's my question. Assuming that we're looking at a situation where a spoken word performance has the same rhyming and rhythmic patterns as a piece of a cappella rap, then what is it that spoken word does differently that would necessitate it being called something other than a cappella rap? What is the difference between this,
But got on different shoes, live in the same building, but we got different views,
and this,
Of course, dressing something suitable and never rude or crude at all. Unimprovable, right on time as usual, more on cue than a snooker ball, but like to play it super cool.
that would necessitate a difference in genre? In this situation, what do we gain from calling it spoken word instead of something like a cappella rap? Well, I don't know how much things have changed since I was in college, but I never saw a coffee house advertising rap night. I always saw slam poetry posters around my college campus. Now, it's not like people are going out of their way to completely override a genre of music on purpose because they don't like what it's associated with. Speaking of which, have any of you guys ever heard of Ford? You know Ford, the car guy way back in the 20s, like invented the assembly line or something like that? Well, turns out that in the right perspective, he's kind of the grandfather of country music. You know, country. Well, way back when in the 1920s, he was the guy who made these cars, changed the course of American history, yada yada. But in Richard Peterson's book, Creating Country Music, he outlines how Ford played this role in the genesis of country music as we know it today. See, Ford hated the things that came out of the city, which his cars and industry kind of like created. But more specifically, he hated the tobacco use, alcohol, and sex. And he associated all three of those with the jazz dance environment. So as a means of counteracting the evils of the jazz dance halls, Ford financed for a bunch of fiddling competitions and old-time square and round dancing. He went on this crusade trying to replace jazz dancing with what we now associate to be country dancing and these fiddling competitions. Now, the problem with all that is that Ford believed that the jazz dance halls weren't an accident. He blamed African Americans, recent immigrants, and something Ford called the international Jew, and even went as far as to create a publication outlining his conspiracy theory that these jazz dance halls were part of some master plan or something. I don't know, it didn't really make any sense to me. But either way, Ford's efforts kind of worked, because by the mid-20s, radio stations started to appear that would play a bunch of what was known at the time as old-time music. One such radio station created during this time and under these circumstances was WSM in Nashville, Tennessee, emceed by a guy called George Hay. And on that station, he had a weekly show called the National Barn Dance. And on November 28th, 1925, the National Barn Dance was renamed the Grand Ole Opry. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Just because Ford was a racist and was trying to manipulate the market doesn't mean that our college campuses are doing the same thing. Besides, let's just say that we ignore that extraordinary racism for a minute, and in the end of the day, maybe Ford just wanted to have more fiddling competitions, right? Sure, if you want to go for that, okay, fine. But Ford wasn't really a one-off. There are plenty of instances of people doing things like this in the music industry. I've mentioned him before on my channel, but it's just a great example of what the music industry does. In the 1950s, Sam Phillips was the owner of Sun Records and Sun Studios and was on the hunt for talent. At some point while trying to make his fortune, Phillips told his secretary his plan. Now I gotta censor this because YouTube doesn't like the language and I'm not super comfortable reading it out loud myself, so you're gonna have to read it. But to frequent viewers of the channel, you'll know that Sam Phillips was the guy who discovered Elvis. Phillips's entire goal was to sell black people music to white people using someone with a white people face, and you can see it in the music. I think the two most cited instances are Little Richard and Big Mama Thornton.
You ain't nothing but a hound. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time.
And I think that now, to this day, when we think of rock and roll, we tend not to think of the black musicians who started the genre.
Well, but today, if I pick up a guitar and start making rock music, black people will tell me I'm trying to be white. It's incredible. The level to which they've managed to market this as something has nothing to do with black people. To the point that black people will tell me if I make rock music tomorrow. It's incredible.
But those two situations were in the past, right? Blackface was a thing when Ford was around and he was racist, but fine, that was way back when. And all this stuff with Elvis happened 10 years before MLK and I Have a Dream. We're aware of this kind of practice now. We know what's going on and we're taking measures to stop these kinds of things. Pepsi just got hammered, remember that? There's no way we're gonna let this happen today. There's just no way something like this could get by again. There's no possible.
Tell me why ain't nothing but a party.
The Backstreet Boys were founded by a guy called Lou Pearlman. Pearlman died in 2016 after being sentenced for 25 years after pleading guilty to conspiracy, money laundering, and making false statements during a bankruptcy proceeding. I was raised not to speak ill of the dead, so unfortunately, that's all you're gonna get about Pearlman. But the story behind the Backstreet Boys is terrifying and outlined in John Seabrook's book, The Song Machine Inside the Hit Factory. So the story goes that Pearlman was in Orlando because of a failed blimp business venture. I'm not kidding. But Orlando is apparently this mecca for child actors and other young talent. Weird, I know. Evidently, the parks attract all the most desperate parents, and believe it or not, this is where Disney picked up their Mouseketeers, including the ones that went on to have pop careers like Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, and Justin Timberlake. Anyway, Pearlman specifically wanted to find 5 white kids to sing for an urban crowd. He picks these kids up, gets them in rehearsals, and then starts getting them gigs at shopping malls and SeaWorld or whatever. But the problem is that the boys thought of themselves as R&B singers, a white version of Boys to Men, not as pop artists. Now, this is a problem because, one, as an adult, I'm not sure you should be having children listening to music that has lyrics like this.
I'll make love to you like you want me to.
But hey, what do I know? And 2, R&B is one of those things that doesn't mean what it actually means. Page 53, Seabrook writes, in the late 1940s, the record industry began to promote these groups under the label rhythm and blues, a term invented to replace the derogatory trade name race music. R&B was a marketing term that became a badge of black musical identity. By definition, a black group would always be labeled R&B, even if they sang pop. Now, I know what you're thinking, and don't worry. Yes, it gets worse. The Backstreet Boys' real break came when BMG couldn't get the R&B scene to break in Germany. Their solution? These 5 white kids. For 3 years between 95 and 98, the Backstreet Boys dominated the charts in Europe with their R&B sounds. And their break in the States didn't come until they released I Want It That Way in 98 that took the whole world by storm. So we have a racist looking to change what he's hearing on the radio for, well, racist reasons. We have a guy willing to take music from one group of people and sell it to another. And then we have a guy who's specifically trying to make as much money as possible with no consideration for what he was doing. Like, the really sick part about the Backstreet Boys story was that Perlman knew that one day people would get tired of the Backstreet Boys. So while he was putting the band together, he went behind their back without them knowing and found a second boy band that would replace the Backstreet Boys once their time was up. That band was called NSYNC. Now, the world of music has a bunch of stories like this, and more appear every day. But the big question here is like, what if you just like the music? What if you aren't a racist and you aren't doing anything for racist reasons, but you just happen to like the music that you're listening to? I actually have a video explaining why that might be happening. In my Coco video, I argued that you might like the music that you like because you listened to it as a young teenager. And there are some neurobiological processes that could be encoding this music in your brain and having it stick there for basically the rest of your life. And you can kind of see evidence for this in certain musicians' biographies. Like, when Mozart was a very young child, he toured all over Europe playing for basically everyone. By the time he was an adult, he was able to merge the Italian, German, and French styles into music that all of Europe would enjoy. By listening to all the diverse pieces in Europe as a young child, he was able to synthesize them into a unifying style as an adult. And interestingly, there are a handful of musicians who have been called cultural appropriators who have stories that can kind of fit into this hypothesis. Benny Goodman, for example, was known as the king of swing back in the 30s when big band jazz was all the rage. He even had this concert at Carnegie Hall called the famous 1938 Carnegie Hall Jazz Concert. Creative, I know. But the thing is that when you track his biography, you can see how and why he grew attached to this music. Goodman was one of 12 to poor immigrant parents in Chicago, and they paid for clarinet lessons to keep him out of trouble. By the time he was 14, Goodman was good enough to perform with Bix Beiderbecke, a jazz cornetist. When he went to high school, he was playing clarinet in dance halls, and by the time he was 16, he joined the Ben Pollock Orchestra, one of Chicago's top bands. And we can see something similar with Elvis. Like, where do we even start with him? He was the king of rock and roll, but at the same time, he's been accused of cultural appropriation, and you can actually see that directly in the music that he performed.
Yeah, Elvis is a perfect example of somebody who appropriated an African-American musical style and combined it with more of a white musical style, which is like country.
But Elvis was raised in a poor 2-bedroom house in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a large black community. It was there when he first picked up a guitar. In '48, when he was 13, he and his family moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and by the time he was in high school, he was spending all his time on Beale Street, which was basically where the blues lived in Memphis. And finally, you can look at someone like Eminem. I don't really think I need to explain his situation, but Eminem was born in 1972 in Missouri. While he was young, he moved between Michigan and Missouri with his mother, but by the time he was 14, Eminem was rapping with his high school friends during lunch breaks. It was at this time he developed the stage name Eminem, and he started freestyle rapping. So assuming that my Coco video is right, you can see how and why these musicians dedicated themselves to the genres that they did. But there's still a problem with all of this. It's tough to ignore that these guys were all white, playing music that was associated with black communities, and that these musicians specifically became enormously successful, especially when you look at what kind of people pull the strings in the music industry.
And a huge part of that is because people have realized that they prefer their black music and their black culture from a non-black face.
Now, regardless of whether or not it is conscious or purposeful, this is something that's been going on for a long time. But why is that? Well, if my Coco video is right and you see teenagers pursuing this type of music because that music releases dopamine in their systems and they're teenagers, so they're all looking for new and exciting experiences, and they listen to it so much that it codes itself into their brain. I'm not going to go into any more detail here. That's literally a different video. But assuming all of that is true, then you might be seeing rebellious teenagers pursuing music that their parents' generation might perceive as, oh, I don't know, the devil's music, degenerate music, or music with no moral or ethics substance to it.
There is no room in this city for the vulgar performances of Elvis Presley.
It's shocking. I watched him gyrate his legs and swivel his hips. And our parent-teachers group feels he should not be on television.
So those rebellious teenagers go out of their way to pursue that music, inadvertently encode it into their head, and by the time they've reached adulthood and want to pursue that music, or even just enjoy music, then they're gonna go look for someone or something that has had a similar experience to themselves. You could even argue that these musicians are the victims of an unfair system. If we live in a systemically racist society, then these people are not cultural appropriators in a malicious or dishonest way. Instead, they are the victims of a system that will disproportionately favor them instead of a true meritocracy that would value their innate contributions to the world of music.
They prefer their black music and their black culture from a non-black face.
Absolutely.
And you have...
That's a culture issue. That is an issue with people out there, the listeners.
Think about it. Is it really their fault that they would be disproportionately advantaged in our society? They just love music and they wanted to give more music to the world. And if they really wanted to make a difference, then it would fall to them to try and offset whatever system gave them that advantage in the first place.
And it was a huge story, I'm surprised it hasn't been brought up by this point yet, that he's trying to curate a Super Bowl show full of black artists that would not be invited to Super Bowl normally.
And when you find these musicians who have that childhood connection to the music, you can see them giving back every single time. Like, you really got to remember that jazz started as a black art form, but back in the 1930s, blackface was still a thing. I heard a story once from my jazz history professor that they once put a black band in blackface because they were worried that their complexion would come off as too pale for the camera and upset the audience. I haven't been able to find that story for myself, but it kind of gives you an idea as to what band directors were dealing with back in the 30s. Goodman knew about all this and was watching it happen, but nevertheless, he pushed to have his band perform at Carnegie Hall, the biggest, baddest concert hall in America. And when he did, even though he had his face on the record, he had black performers on stage with him, and he performed music written by black composers. And when you look at Elvis, yeah, there are criticisms about him taking songs from people like Little Richard and Big Mama Thornton, but just 5 minutes of searching and you start finding stories about him trying to offset the system that disadvantaged performers that came from the musical background he was trying to represent.
Elvis was told by his people that, well, you can leave the black girls home, you don't have to bring them. So Elvis wasn't going to do the Astrodome unless his girls could be with him.
And he personally welcomed me into the family, and for a guy who, you know, didn't really know where he stood, this was very important.
And then Eminem, again, where do you even start? I think a lot of people consider him to be a genuine contribution to the world of hip-hop. I'm not 100% sure. Again, I can't speak for hip-hop. But one thing is for sure, and I've seen other people point this out.
And I'm not saying white artists shouldn't participate in the music. They should. But they should say what Eminem said. You know, to do black music so selfishly and use it to get myself wealthy.
But it really looks like in many ways, Eminem might be his own biggest critic.
So I'm not the first king of controversy. I am the worst things and Elvis Presley to do black music so selfishly and use it to get myself wealthy.
But here's the big question with all this. Who cares? Who cares if the music is similar? Who cares whose face is on the record? If the music's good, why can't we just listen to the music? Especially if there is actually some kind of neurobiological component here. If someone makes a good burger, you can't complain about some other fast food chain coming along and also making burgers. If one person does something better than someone else, then they win, right? Well, it's tough to hear that argument and then hear those exact same people turn around and start complaining about how homogenous pop music is. See, when everyone starts doing the same thing, you become the victim. And you lose. Because when you start seeing the same thing over and over again, you're the one who has to deal with things like the 4 chords and all the excuses for them, like all music has been written before and there's nothing new under the sun. This is how and why so many things on the radio sound so similar. Let me put it to you this way. Think about all the different Let's Players you've seen play the exact same game and have the exact same reaction. Think about all the different YouTubers you've seen have the exact same reaction to the exact same movie trailer at the exact same time in the exact same way. It makes the world really bland. Like, does anyone remember the Irate Gamer? That's kind of my case in point. You can very clearly see the similarities between him and the Angry Video Game Nerd. But the thing is that you can find a whole bunch of people that followed the legacy of the Angry Video Game Nerd.
I would be completely out of my mind to sit here and tell you that every blurred or irritated gamer or film reviewer sitting in front of a camera screaming and exaggerating minor details is somehow ripping off this series. Because this series is basically the equivalent to the invention of lined paper.
But something that all these other people did was that they took the style and made it their own, and they contributed their own voice and opinions to the complete discourse of video games. But with someone like the Irate Gamer, well...
Given that his content was so extremely unoriginal, this made him very unpopular in the reviewer scene.
And this is something I really try to keep in mind when I make my videos. I try to tell myself that if someone else has already talked about it and I don't really have anything to add, then there's no point in me talking about it. So I know I'm not the first person to talk about ear training on the internet, but I found out while I was on a podcast that I might have learned ear training a little differently from other people, so I thought it might be worth it if I put my perspective on ear training out there. I know that there are other videos talking about set theory, but I hadn't seen anyone talking about clock diagrams, probably because my theory professor was the guy who invented them and he had just retired. Now, I want to make this really clear. I'm in no way, shape, or form saying that I'm perfect. Hell, I can't even say I'm half decent. I can 100% guarantee that you're going to find pieces of my videos all over the internet in other YouTube videos, blog posts, articles, wherever. And as far as I'm concerned, that's me screwing up. And I know I've done that before. Because in the end of the day, the whole point of me citing my sources and doing everything I can to research a topic isn't just so that I can tell myself that people are getting the credit that they deserve, it's so I can tell myself that what I'm contributing is actually valuable because maybe not that many other people out there have thought about this in this way before. Like, even this sentiment isn't entirely my own, so you're gonna hear someone else talk about it now.
In days of old, entertainers and writers would measure success by how well regarded their work was, or in how much the wider discussion was furthered by their contribution.
But I know what you're thinking. This has nothing to do with people like Elvis, because Elvis is rock and roll. Eminem has contributed so much to hip-hop that to call him an outsider wouldn't just be wrong, it would be disrespectful. And in many ways, these kinds of musicians might be the first or most significant exposure to that genre of music that you've now grown to love. Besides, like I said, these musicians came from the same world that created the music that they now have grown to define in some way. So even if there were any contributions to these genres of music, it's coming from the same place and the same background, so it really isn't a problem, right? Well, think about this. Imagine that one day you discover that there's an Islamic version of Jingle Bells and they've started singing it in Egypt. That's going to raise a lot of questions. Questions like, why? But say that it happens and they completely change the words and even change a couple of the notes and they add their own embellishments, but you can still tell that it's Jingle Bells. And at the same time, let's say that there's a version of Jingle Bells out there performed by Kelly Clarkson. Which version do you think the Mormons are going to go out and buy? Now, you can kind of see the comparison between this situation and Elvis. Elvis sang music that belonged to black people, but he's white, so he's evil and we should all start the hate brigade on Elvis, right? No, obviously not. This is an extreme comparison with a lot of unfair differences, and Elvis was someone who was raised around this kind of music. He clearly had a passion for it, and he tried to give back whenever he could. All right, so let's change it up. Let's say that instead of an Islamic version of Jingle Bells, it was still an Egyptian version, but it was sung by Egyptian Christians for Christmas. Apparently, Egypt has one of the highest populations of Christians in the Middle East. So let's say that even though the words might be different, that the overall structure is basically the same. What might that version of Jingle Bells sound like? Now imagine if you took this recording and started playing it in all the shopping malls in Salt Lake City, and then they stopped selling Kelly Clarkson's albums. It's the same song, right? Sung by the same people who still care about the original message. It's basically the exact same thing, right? Well, no, you can clearly see that there's an influence that is in some way altering the identity of the piece. But then again, Elvis was raised around the kind of people who created rock and roll, so that's a really unfair comparison because there is nothing else differentiating him from his fellow rock and roll musicians that would then influence the music that he created. Right?
Combined it with more of a white musical style, which is like country, and ended up with something that white people generally saw as innovative, but African American people saw as derivative.
Elvis took my Tutti Frutti, and I was very disgusted. But by him singing it, he really made it bigger and made me bigger.
And so with that, let me ask you again. Assuming that we're looking at a situation where a spoken word performance has the same rhyming and rhythmic pattern as a piece of acapella rap, then what is it that spoken word does differently that would necessitate it being called something other than acapella rap? And the reason this whole situation makes me so nervous is because of Eminem. Eminem hit the scene in the early to mid 2000s. Anyone who was a preteen at that time would have been in college by the early 2010s. Now, it's no secret that Eminem kind of opened up the game for a lot of other artists. I hate to say it, but looking from the sidelines, rap looks to be a little more diverse than it was back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, this is the BYU cheerleading squad, for Christ's sake. And that might be attributed to the Elvis effect that Eminem so clearly pointed out in his own work. Eminem offered a face that an unforgiving community would perceive as less threatening. If the choice is between NWA harshly criticizing the police or this white guy with bleached hair dressed like Robin, which do you think the Mormon mom is going to let their teenager listen to?
And I believe that in 1978 God changed his mind about black people.
Nevertheless, in the last decade, hip-hop has effectively become one of, if not the biggest musical genre, period. Meaning that those teenagers and preteens who are raised in a world where hip-hop and rap was more accessible, like in the late 2000s and early 2010s, are just now starting to get into college. Meaning that, if my math is right, all these people are going back to their dorm rooms and listening to hip-hop. But then instead of going on stage and performing hip-hop or even a cappella rap, they end up performing spoken word at a poetry slam.
And when rappers, and y'all know who y'all are, you know what I'm saying? There's been times where people come up to me or whatever and they'll be like, yeah, you know what I'm saying? I'm going to do my joint a cappella like spoken word. Yo, just because you take a rap and do it a cappella does not make it spoken word all of a sudden.
He couldn't quite get to grips with what they said. So he let his light be eclipsed by what they said. He fell into a lone star state like Texas and felt like even punched in his solar plexus.
I'd lay awake at night just staring at the ceiling. I've spent my whole life trying to run from that feeling of being lonely, that feeling of being lost, that feeling of being sick when the lights turn off.
Now, I get it. I might be a little paranoid. Maybe I'm going way too far with this. Maybe I need to lay off the midnight Wikipedia adventures. But if I'm right, then we might be watching this whole cycle repeat, and soon there will be no one to stop it. Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank my patrons for making these videos possible. The very special thank you to Hayden Elza, Donovan Hodges, Andrew Luke, AFN Matt, Ethan Rooney, Karen Rosenau, Clara Tan, and Billy Vasquez. If you like what you saw here, be sure to check out my other videos for more. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch to have your musical questions answered live. And if you really like what I'm doing, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching.